All organisms have to manage their nutrition, but what happens if all of your food selection is done by your parents? We're interested in this situation, and bees are an excellent and very important group in which offspring are entirely dependent on parents for nutrition. Solitary bees are a really good model system in which to study these questions, because they have a system where one parent provides provides a pollen ball for one offspring to grow. She'll seal the cell and then she'll leave, and that allows us to go and manipulate the pollen received by the larva, and that's exactly what we do here. We remove the larva to an artificial nest, and we replace the pollen with an artificial diet. We conducted experiments under the nutritional geometry framework, which is a graphical approach where you represent foods on a graph. Here we're looking at carbohydrate at the y-axis and protein on the x-axis, and foods are represented by lines which representing a set ratio of protein to carbohydrate in the food, and eating the food represents, you can think of eating the food as moving up the line. So some foods are imbalanced, some foods are perfectly balanced to an organism's optimal intake target, whereas others are imbalanced to either side, to carbohydrate biased or protein biased. We raised solitary bee larvae on 6 different diets, 3 ratios and 2 overall concentrations of protein and carbohydrate, and we found that the heaviest cocoons were obtained when the bees had eaten the highest carbohydrate in their diet and the lowest protein. So the bee larvae grew best on the highest carbohydrate diets. Another thing you can do with nutritional geometry approach is to see how organisms deal with imbalanced diets, whether they choose to stop when having reached a particular target for a given nutrient and tolerate excesses and deficiencies in the other. So they could do that for protein, or they could eat to a carbohydrate target and tolerate variation in protein, or they could do something in the middle and try to get as close to that intake target as possible. We found unambiguously that the solitary bees ate to a carbohydrate target. They would eat and eat until they got a certain amount of carbohydrate, regardless of how much protein they got in their diet. They maintained a constant carbohydrate intake, and that was reinforced when we gave them a choice experiment by giving them different foods on a 48-hour schedule. So we'd give you carbohydrate rich for 48 hours, protein rich for 48 hours, and then vice versa, etc. We found that you would expect that the amounts of carbohydrate and protein would fluctuate if they were eating just randomly among those diets. But what we observed was that the amount of carbohydrate eaten over time remained very, very stable, which is good evidence that they are maintaining a stable intake of carbohydrate. So what we found was that the bee larvae do have some control over their nutritional intake. They grew best on the highest carbohydrate diets, and they maintained a tight control over their carbohydrate intake. We think this could be because they are paying attention to carbohydrate in preparation for the overwinter period. These bees have to survive in their cocoons over winter for until they emerge in the spring, and they need to develop fat reserves to help them to do that. Another reason they might pay attention to carbohydrate is because the pollen provisions have very, very little nectar in them in this species, so they need to make sure that they get enough carbohydrate. We have quite exciting pilot data that we're going to take to the future at different temperatures. It looks as though they maintain carbohydrate at low temperatures, but at high temperatures above 25 degrees C, they appear to switch, and instead they keep the protein constant and tolerate variation in carbohydrate. So with that, I'd like to say thank you to all of the students that worked on this project, and ASAP for a small grant that initially funded the project. Thank you very much indeed.